Okay, so for this week, we're doing something slightly different in that I'm not asking you to read a chapter from the book and then complete some sort of an assignment as a result of that. For this week, we're going to be talking about childcare from a global perspective. There's 2 lectures that you're going to need to watch, and then you're going to complete a discussion post afterwards, after you've watched both of the lectures. And so the first part of the lecture is going to be about the childcare crisis in the United States that we're dealing with currently. I'm going to talk a little bit about history. I'm going to talk a little bit about the build up to the crisis, and I'm going to focus the majority of this lecture on the discussion of the childcare crisis and the 4 factors involved in the crisis, and then our current hopes to mitigate that crisis and how we can improve it. Now, once you've come to the end of both of the lectures, in your discussion posts that you're going to be doing this week, my goal is for you to share something that you've learned. Sorry, I had to close the door because of the dogs. So the first thing I'm hoping for is that you'll share something that you've learned. And so the first part of the discussion post is going to be where you're going to share 3 things that you've learned from the topic this week, from the lectures, from the presentation, the information that I've shared in the presentation. And then it's going to be in the format of I was, impacted by this because, and then you're going to tell why. Or here's something that I learned that was interesting because. And so the point in that is I don't want it to just be, I learned there's a childcare crisis and that's it. I really want you to elaborate on that. I want to focus on your ability to communicate what you're learning and to really share that. For one thing, the more we can communicate, the more that gives me evidence that you are, taking this information and that you're internalizing it. And also, it facilitates communication between us. I like when I read your discussion posts and you guys are having this sort of conversation between you and other people, and you guys are engaging in the topic and you're learning from one another. So that's going to be one part of this assignment. The second part of it is you're going to be taking something that you wonder about. And so this is a basic thing where you think, gosh, I was really interested in learning more about that historical point that Dr. Cottle mentioned, or I'm really interested in mitigating the problem. I want to learn more about this particular issue. And so what you're going to do for the second part of the discussion post is you're going to post a link to an article or a video, or I'm going to mention a documentary in this that I really want you to look into. I'm not assigning it, but I think it would be a good thing for you to check into because it's, well, I'll talk about it in a minute. But what you're going to do is you're going to link to that and you're going to give us a synopsis of what you learned about the topic. And so in this way, we're going to contribute to the class's learning because this is a really big topic. I can only cover so much and expect to hold your attention. And also, this is not a graduate level course. This is an undergraduate course. So we do basic, broad overviews of topics, and we get into more in-depth discussions and study of the topics more, you get into graduate school. So for some of you, you're going to go on and learn more about this. And for some of you, this is not something that you're as invested in as you are in other things. And that's completely fine. Why does this matter, though? Why should we be concerned about childcare? Because some of you are saying to yourself, I don't have kids. I don't expect to have children. So what difference does it make to me if I know anything about childcare? Well, here's why. Childcare affects us as a country because when we have a good workforce, when we have a strong workforce, we have all these support systems to enable that workforce to engage in work. And so part of that is having good, high quality childcare available so that people can work. again, we saw what happened during the COVID pandemic when so many things shut down. We still needed people to work in hospitals. We still needed people to teach the schools. We still needed people to work on the roads or work on cars or, so many things. But when we didn't have people to care for the children, we had this huge problem that resulted in thousands of women leaving the workforce, which set back not just earnings, but it set back women in their careers. It created challenges for families. And, I think as developmental science continues to study the issue, we're going to find that there are going to be ongoing issues for a long time after this. So childcare is an issue that matters to all of us. It should matter to you. It matters to me. I started out my career working in childcare as an undergraduate at Baylor. I worked in a program there in the infant room, and it was, I worked there 5 days a week and then took on extra hours whenever I could to work in other programs that were offered. And then I did nannying on the weekends. And so I was working sometimes, 3 jobs throughout the week to try to get by. But the nice thing about that was that I could go to school, and I took every child development class I could possibly take in psychology, developmental psychology classes, and then took classes in other disciplines like sociology and social work and family and consumer sciences. So I was trying to gain as much information from a research standpoint about children and families, and then I would go in and work in childcare and provided support to these families. But I was also gaining, hands-on experience with children that then benefited me later in my own personal and professional life. So I know that many of you are already working in childcare or preschool, and I know that we have a few students who actually do in-home childcare, which we're going to talk about as well in this lecture. So it matters. For many of you from a professional standpoint, it may matter to you from a personal standpoint when you have your own children, if you don't already. I want to talk just, as I begin this, I want to talk just for a moment about how childcare became more of a professional and in an industry here in the United States. And that really began with World War II. Many of you are aware that when the United States entered World War II, it created a tremendous labor shortage as men of, military serving age went overseas or went off to fight in the military. Well, that left the workforce to women, and many of the women who were able to work in factories during wartime also had young children. So this presented a problem for the United States. And so one particular concern that got involved was the Kaiser Family Foundation, and they created these shipyards nursery schools. And so as women were working in shipyards, they would leave their children with the Kaiser Family Foundation nursery schools, and they were given, hot food or snacks, and they were given an opportunity to take naps during the daytime and learn and read books and all of these different things. And these programs were offered in associations with the universities nearby. So it also provided an opportunity for researchers to take a look at children and how they function during the daytime in group childcare. And this was a way for programs to also to develop high quality standards for childcare. And interestingly, there were some other findings that came out of that time. So a lot of research came from those scientists who were actually studying the way that the care was implemented. Interestingly enough, children under the age of 18 months were not permitted in these centers. They felt that at the time that at that point research was showing that children under the age of 2 did not do so well in group home or group care. So they were not willing to take on children under 2. They lowered the age to 18 months, really to meet some of the demand, but they didn't feel comfortable to go lower than that. So again, it's another way we can see in the evolution of childcare how things are so different now, because here in the States, many programs open it for infants at 6 weeks. And so we don't seem to have that reservation that we did back in the, in the 40s with regard to keeping children younger than 2. The other thing about that is this was a really good example of a family-friendly program, because, once these programs began to run, they could see that, these not only were moms providing care, and then now we needed to provide care for the children, but also they were cooking food, making meals when they left their factory work and picked up the kids. And so, these are women who are exhausted. Now they've got to basically go home and then start their second job and prepare the kids' meals. And this was a labor-intensive process back in the 40s, and there were rations going on and things like that. So another way that the Kaiser Foundation met the need of the families at that time was they were providing hot meals. So at the end of the day, the women would leave the shipyards, they'd go pick up their children, and on their way out the door, they were given a hot meal that they could then take home and eat themselves and serve their children. And then they could start the nighttime process of getting the kids to bed and all of that. So it was a really nice program. Too bad we don't continue to provide those services as well. But it was a really great example of how during a time of crisis in our country, there began this industry, and that was one that was actually pretty well researched and that we've learned from even still. So that may be of interest to you, and I've got the link to that article in our presentation that you can read more about if you're interested in that. So how did we get to the childcare crisis that we are in now? I'm going to talk about the 4 factors that are the things that we would say are the most urgent that we need to provide mitigation for. These 4 factors are the areas where the crisis is the greatest, that have led to the crisis that we are in. I want to lead with the fact that there was already a crisis beginning. Child care programs frequently are, have had difficulty with being able to pay people according to their value who work in child care. It has been a historically underpaid profession, because in order to make child care programs affordable for the families that utilize them, we haven't paid very well. Myself, when I was working as a child care worker, I made $4.32 an hour, and that was beginning in 1989. So again, it wasn't much over what the minimum wage was at that time. It was just very little. So I was taking lots of hours and again working outside jobs in order to pay for gas and things like that. So we know that the economic costs and the needs were kind of already starting to whittle away at the child care programs in the beginning anyway. To make them affordable, they were having to underpay, and therefore it was hard to find people who were willing to work for less pay. Again, this was already happening prior to 2019. The COVID crisis hit, and the problems that were already existing then just were exacerbated. We now know that since December 2019, between December 2019 and March 2021, over 16,000 programs have closed permanently. Children's child care programs and licensed family child care programs have all closed permanently during that period of time. And that represents a 9% decrease in child care centers and daycare centers nationwide. If you dig into the Child Care Aware report that I've linked in the presentation, you'll note that that works out to be, that number of centers closing works out to be thousands of spots that, you know, are not filled. So that you can't just think of it as a child care center is closed. You have to think of it as how many children now don't have child care available to them. And we know that, and again, this was already happening prior to COVID shutdown, but now we, you know, our current figures, and this is very recent, this was just recently released, we know that over 50% of all Americans live in a child care desert. Now, what is a child care desert? Many of you have heard the term food desert, and you know that what that means is for that means that a community that does not have access to a supermarket or some type of grocery store that sells fresh fruit and vegetables, like perishable items. Well, childcare desert is very similar in that idea. It's a community where there is a lack of childcare, and what that translates to from a research standpoint is it represents that there's 3 children for every 1 open slot. So 1 child gets in, 3 children, you know, 2 other children are still in need of care. So I've given you a screenshot in the presentation of Dallas, what the city of Dallas looks like. And there's 2 sides to the screen. On the right side, you see poverty, the poverty level, and you can see the level of poverty by the color dark red. It shows you how much poverty is on the right side. And in that, on the left side of the screen, which you can also, I've given you the link to how to look it up, but on the screenshot, you can see on the left side whether there's a scarcity of childcare or not. And that's, again, highlighted by dark orange. So if you see dark orange circles, that represents that that's an area where there's a childcare scarcity. Again, I've given you the link to look up childcare deserts in your area. You can input the community that you live in and see how it fares as far as the number of childcare programs that are available to you and or available to families, and how much poverty there is in that area, which again, we've seen an increase in poverty since COVID. So this is another issue that is affecting the United States, and so it's something that, again, we need to mitigate. Currently, again, where I want to say before we get too much into the major contributors of the child care crisis, I want to say that the current recommendation by the Department of Health and Human Services is that only 7% of a family's income, total household income, should go towards child care. And one of the things that we have seen, and that is currently reported, is that presently, due to inflation, around 10% of the median family household income is in married family households is going towards childcare expenses. Now, for single parents, that percentage is closer to 35%. So it's a pretty significant amount. It's a pretty significant percentage of that household income is having to go to childcare. And childcare is not the enemy. Again, this is a historically underpaid industry. But there's a gap in what families can pay and what childcare programs need to take in order to meet the bottom line. So here's the part where I want you to make note. The 4 major contributors to the childcare crisis are supply, demand, affordability, and workforce. Supply simply means the amount of childcare programs that there are. That goes back to the desert, the childcare desert, ratio. Again, is how many childcare programs do we have in an area? And so the supply has declined. You know, as we've seen these programs close, we have seen these shortages increase. So right now what we have is a lowered supply. So we don't have enough. That's really simply what that is. The demand, however, has remained pretty consistent. So we have more people needing childcare than we have people who are supplying childcare. That's really very simple. Prior to COVID, about 40% of children under the age of 10 were receiving childcare in an informal setting. And what that means is like a friend or a family member or a neighbor was providing the childcare for that family. So again, 40% is pretty high. So most of the time in the United States, when people were leaving their children to go to work, they were leaving them in an informal setting that's not licensed. They were being paid typically, but the children were in that kind of a setting, and sometimes that can be inconsistent because of it's an informal setting. So it's thought that a professional childcare center tends to be a little bit more stable because there's more staff there. So if someone's out, then they have someone else who can come in and substitute. So there are not so many gaps in care. In informal settings, that can be a little bit more unstable. And then we have in-home family childcare centers, which again make up a big number of childcare providers. And the demand for in-home childcare is pretty high as well, because sometimes people feel a little bit more comfortable leaving their children with an in-home provider. That was the kind of care that we utilized when I was working in early childhood intervention when my first son was born, is we went to an in-home childcare provider who was professional. Unfortunately, we've seen this decline in another one of these contributing factors to decline because of affordability. It is expensive to leave children in care, and it can be anywhere from $145 a week to leave an infant in a childcare program. Again, that's per week, or it can be $200 a week depending on the program. So again, these are kind of the factors that families have to look at: is can we afford to go to the program where the kids are going to be in a lower ratio, where there's maybe going to be one teacher for 3 infants, which is ideal according to the National Association for the Education of Young Children. That would be the preferred ratio, would be 1 teacher for 3 infants, and not more than that. When I worked in childcare, and I think this is pretty close to, the ratio is improved now, but when I worked in childcare in the late 80s, early 90s, the ratio was 1 to 6. So it was 1 person to 6 infants, which could get pretty wild in an infant room. I think that the Texas standard is improved to it's either 4 or 5. I've got that information in your presentation. So, for those kinds of programs where you have a better ratio, you pay more per week. And the teachers tend to be trained a little bit better. But in a program where there's a higher ratio, again, and that may be because of shortage in staff, it can be a number of reasons, but those do tend to be cheaper, but the risks are a little bit higher in those programs. So, families may have to look, rather than at the program that's higher quality, they may have to look at, well, what can I afford? So again, affordability has been another contributor to this childcare crisis, because it is expensive. We are we're in a time of inflation, and so it costs more to run a childcare program, even with reimbursements from grants. From the U.S. Department of Agriculture has a grants program that childcare programs can apply for those grants and get reimbursed pennies on the dollar for serving healthy and nutritious foods in their programs. And so, that helps some, but when milk has increased price per gallon, the amount of money that the USDA is providing in reimbursements just doesn't go as far as it used to. If it's 30 cents on the dollar for a lunch, well, we're spending far more than we have ever, and probably, I think it's 40 years on foods and supplies. So again, affordability paying people who can work and are high, have experience and are good at their job. It costs money to do these things. Rent is higher on a lot of buildings. If someone's working out of their home, again, the costs of energy to heat and cool, those things have increased. Gas is higher. Everything affects the bottom line for a program. Finally, workforce. The workforce has been in decline for quite some time. Again, finding people who are willing to work in childcare is harder now than it ever has been. But for programs like I was speaking about in a moment ago, men and women who work in an in-home family care program where they're at their own home and they're providing care for children, that is a very isolating program. For these folks who work in home, they're providing a necessary service for families and may also be keeping their own children, and many times their hours are very variable so that they can take care of children who are being left at odd times, but if they get sick, those families can't, they don't have care. If something happens, they're all by themselves throughout the day, and it's harder for them to take vacations. Many do, but it's harder because it interferes with the families that need care. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this that there's a documentary that you may be interested in watching, and it's beautifully done. It's called Through the Night. Again, I will provide a link to that documentary in the presentation, but it's about a family, a couple, that Dolores and Patrick Hogan, that provide a 24-hour child care program in their home to families, and this program is in New York. And Dolores and Patrick Hogan have been providing care for over 20 years. At the point that the documentary was filmed, they had been doing it for 22 years. And what it centers on the work that they do, but it also is talking about, or the other people in the film are families who bring their children to their in-home program. And many of these are women who are doing shift work, single women who are the sole providers for their family. And so they're having to leave the children late at night and go into work, or maybe they're doing work that, like one woman works in a bakery and she's doing, work that she goes in really, really early and maybe works like 6 days a week. And so, not a typical childcare center would not provide those hours, care for those hours. So Dolores and Patrick are actually providing care round the clock to children, and their own children assist in the child care program as well, their children are grown. But it is a beautiful documentary. When I taught program planning and administration before, I assigned this as instead of reading, this was the viewing that students did. But because it is no longer offered freely, you have to have a subscription to PBS, or maybe you can rent it on YouTube. I can't really assign that to you all, but again, I do highly recommend this documentary. It is so nice, so beautifully done, and you can see firsthand the challenges of running a child care program in home and the toll that it takes both physically and mentally and emotionally on not just the folks providing care, but the families who are leaving their children there, how hard it is for them as well. Unfortunately, I think what the common, sort of dialogue about childcare is, well, people have to know going in, having children, that it's going to be expensive and they shouldn't have kids if they can't provide care. And that is such a narrow discussion of the bigger problem is that, we have children not just because we're being careless, but because we want to have children, we want to bring children into the world. And also, reality is that children keep us going. We don't have a country, we don't have a world if we don't reproduce ourselves. And again, I'm going to talk more about that in the second lecture. But for this portion of it, I think we need to be more gracious and more generous in our discussion. And rather than looking at, childcare as, well, it's just an issue of the individual family, we need to get away from that sort of philosophical underpinning that we have here in the U.S. that says that we are independent, we are autonomous, and therefore we need to take care of ourselves and pull ourselves up by the bootstraps. Children are a collective concern. Children are a collaborative concern. And so we need to be collaborative and collective in our approach to mitigating the concerns. So there are a number of ways that we can improve childcare in this country. One way is to offset the costs, to improve the bottom line for families and for childcare programs, and enable them to continue to stay in business, is to pour more funds into the childcare industry. And presently, the Build Back Better Act is one way that the current administration is proposing to stimulate recovery for childcare. And so if that passes, then there'll be funds essentially to go back into these programs. We also have a pretty big deficit in after school care, and we can't really forget that after school care is a big part of child care as well. And currently we have 7.7 million children who are unsupervised and alone after school. That's a really big number. And that there are 22 million students who cannot access after school programs, despite the fact that we have two big after school program grants that are administered by the U.S. government. The first one is the Child Care and Development Block Grant. That's the Department of Health and Human Services administers that particular grant. And then the 21st Century Community Learning Centers grant, which is, that one's distributed by or managed by the Department of Education. Now for myself, I used to run an after school program that met once a week at the campus that I taught at when I taught kindergarten. And it was the focus of my dissertation work. It was a girls' club that met after school, and we did sort of like an enrichment program for after school. Well, like many after school programs, we shut down because of COVID. COVID limited the number of people who could be on campus. There weren't so many volunteers that could come on campus. We couldn't have, additional parents coming onto campus. We were trying to, minimize the spread of, COVID. And so for myself, we had to, shut down my program. I couldn't continue to run that because I was not, considered essential staff. However, that does mean that for families who depended upon that additional care after school, that dries up. And so, again, redistributing some more of that money, encouraging more jobs to be created when we have after school programs and more childcare programs will definitely help the industry. So again, I've provided some information. You can look into more about that. And then when we talk about quality and improvement of quality, the National Association for the Education of Young Children does have a credentialing system for programs, and they do a lot of research on quality in childcare programs. And credentialing is sort of a significant step up from accreditation. So a licensed childcare program can be accredited or licensed by the state in which they operate. And it basically means that they meet a certain set of minimum standards in order to be licensed. And not every childcare program is licensed, but if a program is licensed, then they would fall under this, accountability program and this sort of we're going to send people out to sort of make sure that you meet our minimum standards for health and space. For the NAEYC, that credentialing program goes over and above that. So if the state says it's okay to have one teacher for 4 or 5 infants, NAEYC says, well, we prefer that you have one teacher for 3 infants, and that's a minimum standard for us. And so we're going to send out people to make sure that you're following our standards. And so for parents, basically what they can say is, okay, if this program abides by the NAEYC standards, it is far superior and a lot more stringent than the state licensing standards. Another thing that states can do to improve the quality of childcare programs is to participate in a quality rating and improvement system, QRIS system. In Texas, ours is called the Texas Rising Star program. And you can, again, I'm going to have the link there for you so you can look into that. But it's the rating system that Texas uses to basically make sure that programs adhere to a certain set of standards and, quality. And Texas Rising Star provides resources for parents. They provide trainings for childcare programs and for their staff. The thing about QRI or the Texas QRS program is it really is affiliated with the Texas Workforce Commission. So if a childcare program is willing to accept grant money or tuition reimbursement money for families who are engaged in looking for work through the Texas Workforce Commission, then they would have, in order for them to accept that grant money, they have to also be involved in Texas Rising Star, that QRIS program. So it's kind of a thing that, well, we have a QRIS program, which is recommended that each state have one, but it's really primarily for those programs that are involved in Texas Workforce Commission. So other programs can be involved in that QRIS program, but it's not necessary unless you're accepting Texas Workforce, funds. So those are, again, some of the highlights of what I want to talk to you about with regard to the childcare crisis. Again, those major contributors are supply. We just don't have enough childcare programs. Demand. We have a lot of demand. Affordability. Costs a lot of money to run a childcare program, and we really need to figure out a way to offset those costs to improve the costs for families and also for childcare operators. And then workforce. We have a decline in the workforce. We have a pretty significant decline. Again, you can see those figures in the link to the Childcare Aware report that I've got there for you. So be thinking about what from this lecture was interesting to you. What did you learn that you didn't already know? How does this tie to your learning and what you already know about childcare? And then, what do you think? What are your thoughts on ways to improve childcare? What are some of the things that you've seen work? Because there are a lot of novel ways to provide childcare, and not everybody has the same idea about pumping money into the industry. But this is a good thing for you to think about as you reflect and talk with your classmates in the discussion post. Okay, so this concludes part 1. Part 2 will expand the discussion to talk more about how is childcare affected by family policy, and how is that impacted the world with regard to how does the world look at childcare? How are other countries tackling this particular issue?